Hello and welcome to this week's review on Dragon Ball Daima. This week I'm looking at the episode Panzy, and we kick this review off as we always do with these reviews by talking about the positives, and we start with the headline positives. All the things I enjoyed about this episode and then some. We kick off with the headline positives, and just by saying that this is a well-paced and efficient episode, the action is fun and vibrant, and it sets up an interesting future path for Glorio. I know that my reviews on this channel tend to talk about the mechanics of television shows, movies and scripts in a way that's generally a lot more mechanical than a lot of other broadcasters on this site, so me saying that this was a well-paced and efficient episode is going to feel rather soulless and mechanical for someone who is involved with the arts, but hey, this is true. I mean, this is the best description that I could give of this episode, because let's address the elephant in the room here. This is a connecting tissue episode. Whilst we're being introduced to two new recurring cast members, this episode acts more as a way to set up future events and future plot threads, more so than it is upon acting upon those events as well as pushing the wider story. Episodes like this can feel rather lackluster because there isn't much of a resolution to offer. Nothing major, nothing that can really push the events they're in, and there's oftentimes not even much within the episode itself that gets resolved. Here that isn't necessarily the case for reasons I'll discuss shortly. As such, these connecting tissue episodes, regardless of what program that it is part of, whether that be animated or live action, be that an adaptation or original property, they can end up feeling rather frustrating. Whilst nothing major gets resolved in this episode, at the very least we do get the satisfaction of having a decent action sequence which is self-contained enough and does have a fun resolution to it. Oh sure, it wasn't exactly going to recontextualise much, and it wasn't really going to be a shock horror how the end result went with it, but at least we get the visceral fun of seeing Goku knock people in the head. But like I say, that's something we'll discuss shortly. With all that said, however, I do have to say that the elements of this episode, the elements that were introduced in this episode, were introduced in a way which was even-handed, in a way which was progressively dealt towards and gave us time to process everything that we're seeing and everything that we're experiencing. Elements such as the fact that margin around these parts can live for thousands of years is a fact that's neither dwelt on for too long nor rushed past too quickly. The fact that Panzy is the daughter of this realm's king isn't made out to be a bigger thing than it is, and it is something that is ultimately introduced for the sake of plot relevance more so than anything grander than that. There isn't some grand explanation as to how all of this works on the royal line of succession or anything along those lines that you could otherwise get in other series and programs. No plot point in this episode ever overstays its welcome and is present for as long as it needs to in order to feel like it is effective, yet sits in a series of events rather comfortably. There is never this feeling of anything rushing by too quickly or dragging too long. Yes, this might not make for an episode which is thrilling or viscerally visually exciting, but it is engineered in a way that lets us enjoy this world and this story in a more of a comfortable way to me. It doesn't feel like we're rushing from one thing or the other, and I do appreciate that. I appreciate when modern television programs are able to deal with their material in a way which has a decent pacing to it. Far too many programs just rush through everything. It's one of the reasons that I really enjoyed the latter half of the Stephen Moffat run of Doctor Who, because say what you will about his episodes, but he at least often gave us time to process everything was on screen. A lot of other programs and all those series of Doctor Who immediately before and after that less so, but that's a discussion for all of the time. Within this episode, every moment that we get, be that a major thing for the episode itself, a major thing for the story, or something minor, it sits in the episode in a way that feels earned, and it never feels like outright fan service. Which is of course referring to the action sequence that we get in this episode, which I will admit is something that I probably would have talked about earlier in this review had it not been for a certain moment, which you're all likely aware now what that certain moment is going to end up being. This of course being the fact that Goku goes Super Saiyan for the first time in this form, in this series. Woo! Get out the klaxon and the loud bell and all that kind of malarkey. Look, to actually just get into the meat and potatoes of the animation and what we get here, the action sequence itself is a ton of fun. It is well choreographed, well presented, much like the action sequences we've got thus far in this entire series. I will say is I feel that the pub brawl fight that we got a few weeks back and what we get in last week's fight were just stronger visually and had a lot more flair and dynamism to what we got this week. Though, to be fair, that's understandable because the fight this week wasn't really the focus of much of anything. And I will be honest, had it just been Goku duffing people up in a fun way like he did in this episode, I'd have been fine with that because, again, it is presented in a way which has a fluidity and a flair to it that doesn't feel as though it's being overpowering. That it's not showing itself, doing anything to show off the animation in a way which feels as though it gets uncanny. Because let's face it, there are a lot of other anime programs out now that, whilst the animation is good, it can be presented in a way which feels uncanny and out of place, which for certain series can work, but for others it feels like, yeah, your rotoscoping here is not the best, is it? But that's a discussion for all of the time. The big element of interest in this action sequence, and the thing that I think people will take away from the most with this, is the introduction of the Super Saiyan elements. That is something I think is probably more interesting to me. And these, I will be honest, I think is something that I would have thought they would have saved for a later reveal. I mean, yeah, we know that Goku can go Super Saiyan. We know that this is going to be an aspect of the series at some point. However, I always felt that it would be something that would be saved more for a more dramatically interesting moment. You can kind of see it forming in your mind. Goku and his friends are fighting off against some particularly powerful demon, and Goku's just inherent strength and power is not really cutting it. He has been struggling to get a hold of Super Saiyan up until that point, and then, just when it looks like all hope is lost, Goku taps into Super Saiyan once again and duffs up the bad guy, and we all go from there. Great, fun, epic moment. That is something I was expecting here. And that is something that we don't get. There doesn't seem to be much a level of stress or strain on him, which is kind of a little bit weird, particularly when you bear in mind that in the early sections of this series, a great deal of attention was brought to the fact that Goku and his friends were struggling to use their power. They were struggling to fly. So the fact that he's able to call upon this legendary super duper ultra power relatively casually feels odd to me. I mean, maybe having a scene later on that explains, yeah, he can't pull on that all that frequently and it's almost like a once per day thing, sure, whatever, but I think there needs to be a little bit of an explanation as to what kind of impact that has had on him. Again, I still think it would have been a lot more effective to tease and set it up for later on, but hey-ho, it's different strokes for different folks. I will admit that at this stage in my life, I'm not someone who goes gaga for the Super Saiyan stuff. Oh sure, I thought it was cool 20 years ago when I was far younger, and now, yeah, it's still fun, but it's not the nay plus ultra as far as things I'm looking for with Dragon Ball. I'm not someone that goes wild whenever a new superpower or a new transformation is introduced into it. I'm far more interested to how those powers are used and how they're breathed into the narrative, more so than the fact of, oh, look at this, Goku's hair's changed a brand new colour for this story arc. And apologies if it does sound as though I'm having a go at anyone there, but that's a whole other discussion for all of a time. I'm not having a go at people if people are excited by all this, and far be it from me to crap on that enjoyment of it. I will be interested to see, however, how other people, other broadcasters on YouTube and on other discussion forums and websites end up interpreting that little bit after Goku goes Super Saiyan. You know, that moment that after he's done that thing where he goes Super Saiyan and everyone just flies back out of the way, and there's that moment where he just depowers and he's got that little aura around him. Something that we've never seen thus far in this entire series, any series of Dragon Ball itself thus far. How are people going to interpret that? Are they going to interpret this as being a new form that he has, and this is a teaser, something for later on? Are they going to interpret it as some kind of just strange quirk of Super Saiyan? Like if he depowers down very quickly, it's almost like static electricity in a kind of way? Or are they just going to argue that it's just a sense of creative flair and very little else? In the grand scheme of things, am leaning more that it's just a case of creative flair more so than anything else. And if there is anything else here at play, it is, as I've said, a little more than just the equivalent of static electricity, albeit the superpower key blaster version of all of this. If you were wanting to get a little bit tricksy and a little bit creative, you could argue that this is a reference of sorts to the fake Super Saiyan, the false Super Saiyan form that we saw in the Lord Slug movie, and then this is yet another nod and a reference to the past of Dragon Ball. I don't think that is the case, but it's something that I I would personally like to headcanon, not in terms of a meta sense, well, not in terms of a literal sense of it, but certainly on more of a meta standpoint. Because as I've said, one of the things I do enjoy about Daima is the fact that as a series, it feels like it is a nod and celebration to Dragon Ball as an entire entity. That there are references to everything that we have seen. There is references to the original Dragon Ball, there's references to Super, to GT, to Z, to the video games. That would be this faux Super Saiyan little nod thing would be another nod to the film universe of all of that. Again, I don't think that is the case, and to be blunt, I do have a feeling that some people are going to end up interpreting that. Though, of course, the greater thing that I think a lot of other broadcasters are going to be doing is the Super Saiyan is back, boys! New form confirmed, question mark, exclamation point, gasp in the thumbnail. I mean, sure, if that's the way they want to play things, then fine. I think that, for my money, I just think it's rather neat. The action sequence itself, yeah, it is relatively weak in comparison to the things we've had thus far, fun as it is, though I have this sinking suspicion that by virtue of it having Super Saiyan in it, it's going to end up being considered the best thus far, which, hey-ho, again, different strokes for different folks. I will to move on to something that's only semi-scripted. I have to say is that I did find the little bit with Goma and Dende and the storyteller to be fun for what it is, and it does help Goma's plans for Dende to become a little bit clearer. At the moment where Goma is scolding the storyteller for not putting more passion into it, not putting more flair and performance into the reading of this story, I thought was a fun little bit. It gives us a teensy-weensy bit of an insight into the character of Goma, and it kind of hints that there might not be this true darkness to his soul, that maybe there is this slight softer side to him as a villain. Though, granted, we haven't really seen much of him as being much of a real effective villain. Of course, thus far, we've had the moments of, oh, he's stealing people's life force, life energy, as part of some kind of tithe system, but outside of that, we've not seen them themselves being truly evil. They are more the bungling evil that we get from, for a reference within this series, Count Pilaf, and to other series more a Team Rocket kind of thing, more so than he is necessarily a true evil being. I mean, had he been a character more like a Deborah, or had this been Deborah saying to, put a bit more effort into it, put a little bit more passion into it, then it would have been made for a more interesting moment, hinting to a different side of them, and to maybe that whilst they are a bad guy, they're still at least good to the people that work under them. Which is an interesting take to go with all of this, and we'll see where all that ends up progressing. I'm not 100% sure as to whether or not Goma is ultimately going to be the big bad of this series. I think there may be another evil lurking within the shadows, and that maybe this episode is hinting at that, because towards the end of this episode we do get the major suggestion, I would say major plot point, because it's not quite a plot point yet, so I really can't. The major suggestion that there is something rather sus about Glorio, that he may have darker plans and schemes afoot, and that he may be the traitor among us. Yes, I'm definitely going out my way to make these references. Don't shoot me. I just really want to. I've not had my dinner yet, so whatever. The suggestion that we have here is that he's not exactly a straight shooter, that he has darker intents, or at least motivations that he's not really being clear of right now. Now, it may well be that next week's episode we get into a little bit more as to what he's truly aiming for, or at the very least we might get his, I will emphasise, his motivations as to why he's doing that. Whether or not those motivations are true, we'll see in the due course of time, but I am just kind of surprised, because I do look at other reviews and other broadcasters and commentators' feelings on this series, but I am surprised as to how many people have decided right off the bat that this guy was a goodie just from the off. This guy, from what we know of him, is a hired gun. He's a mercenary. He's a professional. He knows how to do his job. And if his job is to round up Goku and the Supreme Kai and whomever else for whatever reason, he's not going to overplay his hand. He's not going to show that dark intent from the off. He's going to try and trick them and deceive them as for long as possible so that narratively we can get the portrayal moment. If we're constantly having these sideward glances and him being in the shadows suggesting that something's dark about him, then the audience is going to understand that and the impact of that is going to be weaker. We haven't had anything like that. So there's two possibilities here. Either he's a bad guy and Akira Toriyama was being rather subtle with all of this, or this is something of a red herring and he'll turn out to be a largely good, though still ultimately rather neutral force in all of this. This is another episode, I should point out, however, that starts with the blurb about Super Saiyans remaining younger for longer and being a powerful race. And this isn't, I'll be honest, it isn't beyond the realms of possibility that isn't there just for the sake of a pre-intro tease. It's not just there for setting the tone. I feel that it is there for a specific reason. And this is an episode, as was the previous one, where we had the detail about there being machines that can steal life energy. So it could hint at what the dark intent is here for Glorio, or whomever may be paying him, or some other character mixed in with all of this. He may at some point try to redeem himself if he has been brought in over his head, but all I'm saying is, watch out for watch out for Glorio. There's a reference that no doubt I've bollocksed up, but whatever, we'll move on. And with that in mind, we'll get into the negatives. And I have to say is that this, in all wholehearted honesty, isn't really negative in the traditional sense of the word, and anyone that's been following my reviews for the longest time will know, or at least can make a good guess as to what my issue with this episode is ultimately going to end up being, and that is the fact, and as I've hinted at earlier on in this review, this is a connecting tissue episode. This is an episode that does a fine job establishing new details, new plot points, new future things that they could go down. We do have a fight sequence which has a satisfying conclusion, but at the end of the day, this episode is ultimately more focused on setting up the next few episodes, more so than it is about dealing with the matters at hand or the overall story. I was honestly expecting them to go back and deal with that village that was being hassled. I mean, if this was OG Dragon Ball, they would have gone and done that. Although, to be fair, if this also was OG Dragon Ball, then this whole little sparring session, training session that Goku has towards the end of the episode would have been a 2-episode thing. This episode probably would have ended with a bit of Goku looking like he's about to get knocked out by someone bigger and stronger than him, with the announcer going, "Is this the end for Goku? Has he fought off more than he can chew? Find out in the next episode of Dragon Ball," or words to that effect. And yeah, that didn't ultimately end up being the case, even though that part of my mind was expecting that was going to be the end bit for the tease of all of it. But still, there's nothing wrong with an episode of anything being a connecting tissue episode, not in function and not necessarily in execution per se. But I do think that when we have episodes like this, episodes which are connecting tissue episodes, there needs to be something more of a problem that needs solving so that we have a bit more of a satisfying experience with the episode in and of itself. Even if that problem at hand is only something that only really lasts for the sake of this one episode. Like, for example, the fight sequence, whilst it does remedy that feeling, it could have had a little bit more stakes at hand to give us a little bit more something to go with that. Or failing that, I think the episode itself needed a greater sense of it moving the grander story, more so than it was necessarily about setting up what's coming next week and the week after. Which it does do to a point, but still, I think that any kind of suspicion that we have with Glorio is going to be dealt with and resolved with next week's episode, and isn't necessarily a setup for something grander that won't be revealed until the end of the series. But we'll soon see as far as all that is concerned. With that in mind, let us get into the overview, and I have to say that this was a fun episode. I mean, I apologise if it seems, I don't have much to say about it, despite the fact this episode is going on about as long as it usually ends up doing. This review, I should say, but still, I think that it's an episode that at the end of the day need a little bit more spice. You need a little more of an edge to it to make it interesting. It didn't need to be dark, it didn't need to be edgy, but I think there needed to be a little bit more of a problem here that the heroes can solve, so that in coming weeks we can, say that this wasn't just a connecting tissue episode. It does set up for some interesting stuff. The new guy who's obsessed about doing his hair and he's going off to get Vegeta and that. Cute, fun. We'll see where all that goes. But with all that said and done, it's time to get into Comment Corner! It's time for Comment Corner. My dinner's still kind of warm. Woo! So, We'll go into comment corner and I'll do this as effectively and as respectively as I can do. This week's comment comes from the previous video, Dragon Ball Daima episode titled Chappy. Chappy? No, Chatty. Bloody hell, Chappy. I think I'm the first person to mention that movie since it came out. Anyway, Chatty. This is a comment that comes from Big X1 that says, "This was a fun episode, but I liked the action in the previous episode. I hope we see the fusion at some point and it isn't a tease." Thank you for your comment, and I will be honest, I would be shocked, genuinely shocked, if we got to the end of this entire Dragon Ball Daima thing and the fusion thing just didn't happen and that Goku and Vegeta or whomever didn't fuse. Okay, sure, the bad guys might do it, it might be done for a gag, but I would be shocked if it didn't feature at all. I know that Akira Toriyama did like to be subversive with some of these things and did like to do fun, silly bits here and there, but yeah, I don't think he would really not do that, especially if this is supposed to be this grand celebration of Dragon Ball as an entire series. But with that said, let me know what you thought about this week's episode. Let me know in the comment section down below and you will be read out in a future video. Nothing else for me to say other than say thank you all for listening and see you next time. Goodbye!